or is this a new arrangement? But the bigger question is this. This is the first step towards moving in a direction of normalization. This is disengagement. There are two more steps to go: de-escalation and demilitarization or de-induction. But at the moot of it, after what happened in Galwan 4 years ago, when China unilaterally resorted to violence to change the status quo, the moot question we need to ask is, can India and China ever be able to trust each other?
सीमा पर शांति और स्थिरता बनाए रखना हमारी प्राथमिकता रहनी चाहिए। म्यूचुअल ट्रस्ट, म्यूचुअल रिस्पेक्ट और म्यूचुअल सेंसिटिविटी हमारे संबंधों का आधार बने रहना चाहिए।
It's important for both sides to have more communication and cooperation, properly handle our differences and disagreements, and to facilitate each other's pursuit of development aspirations.
So we have some breaking details at the top of the show on how India and China brokered this deal on a new patrolling arrangement. The impasse at the border for the last 4 years has now been resolved. At least the first step has been taken in that direction. A government source has revealed to CNN News 18 that it was China which was eager to resolve the LAC issue and that the talks had reached an advanced stage in the last 6 months. Also, what it means in terms of the next steps. We have some details on that. Aman Sharma, our political editor, is now breaking this for us at the top of the show. Aman, what further details do we have about A, what brought this about, and more importantly, the trajectory forward?
Well, Zaka, what we are learning from top government sources is that this particular talks were moving in a very positive direction over the last 6 months. Not just India, but China was also very eager to arrive at a complete disengagement on the rest of the two friction points. And this has also got to do a lot, what government sources are saying, with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's twin visits to Russia in the last 3 months, the messaging which went from these visits, because these visits happened and obviously the West and especially the US was not very happy with Prime Minister Modi's visits to Russia, but Mr. Modi still went there twice, and that is what has apparently brought China to the table to be very eager to resolve this issue. Obviously, there have been 72 rounds of talks, both at the military level and the diplomatic level, and 2 key meetings held by Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar with his counterpart in July on foreign soil. This was also something which had, settled the broad contours of the agreement, which has been now finalized upon. What we are learning now that the de-escalation and the de-escalation process will also be quick. It will not be left to a long drawn process. The disengagement is complete. Both the disengagement and the de-escalation process will also be a quick process, and both sides are very eager to move fast on it. The de-induction, which is the final step, could take some time because obviously India would like to watch and verify kind of an approach with China before going in for de-induction, and that may take some time. But de-escalation could happen soon, and we could also see that Zaka in the Prime Minister's speech today when he met the Chinese Premier, when he has said that we welcome the recent agreement for complete disengagement and resolution of issues, and he also said that the special representatives on the India-China boundary question should meet at an early date. So I think that urgency is very much there from both sides to speed up this de-escalation process at the earliest.
All right, Aman Sharma, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining us at the top of the show with that breaking information. Let's try and put this into perspective. It's taken a long time coming 4.5 years since the Galwan clash, 5 years since the last formal bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. Let's open this up to our guest. Mr. Shashank is former Foreign Secretary to the Government of India. Aina Tanjan, Senior Fellow at the Taiha Institute in Beijing. Nitin Gokhale, National Security Analyst, who's in fact live from Kazan, I believe, tonight. And Zorawar Daulat Singh, author and Foreign Affairs Analyst, is also joining us. Nitin, let me start with you first because you're there on ground zero. You have seen firsthand this bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. Two questions. One, do we have a backstory as to how this has been achieved? Because for 4.5 years, the relationship was not normal. Even a few months ago, the foreign minister was asked about it and he said 75% of the issues have been resolved. How were the last two friction points, Depsang and Demchok, how was the disengagement there arrived at?
Well, it goes back to the September 12 meeting between NSA, Ajit Doval and Wang Yi, the foreign minister. Also, both of them are the special representatives from either side. Their meeting in Russia, when they were here for the Brics NSA's meeting, on the sidelines of that group meeting, they had a long discussion. And if you go back to the press note issued by the Ministry of External Affairs that day, it actually says that Mr. Doval emphasized that the remaining two outstanding issues of friction points at Depsang and Demchok, which were not mentioned, but all of us know which are those friction points, need to be resolved expeditiously, need to be disengaged as soon as possible. Only then the further resolution or further brokering of peace can happen. So I think the icing on the cake came there. The military and the diplomatic officials were discussing it threadbare for the past 4 weeks. And the agreement, I believe, after talking to people here and in Delhi, the agreement finally was inked on Monday morning, as late as 5 a.m. on Monday morning, after which Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri announced the disengagement at the two remaining friction points. So once that was done, that was India's big ask, that Depsang and Demchok must be resolved to move forward on anything else. So having done that, now the bilateral meeting between the two leaders has taken place, and now they've directed the SR level talks must be resumed as soon as possible. This is also the resumption is happening after 5 years. That's the backstory basically. But India held firm on the big ask it had about getting the access to petrol points 10, 11 and 12 beyond Depsang or beyond the Y junction, and the dispute at Demchok, which China has acceded to. And from there on, the entire process became smooth.
Okay. So let me ask Mr. Shashank, the former Foreign Secretary, it's one thing to arrive at a patrolling agreement, and I think Nitin Gokhale is absolutely right. It's taken 4.5 years to get to this point. 31 meetings of the WMCC, 21 meetings at the Corps Commander level, multiple meetings between the Foreign Minister and his counterpart, the NSA and his counterpart. So credit where credit is due. But ultimately, this is just the first step that has been crossed. There is still de-escalation. There is still a de-induction of the troops, because you can't have the situation of 50,000 troops on either side in an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation. But the bigger question, Mr. Shashank, after what happened in Galwan in 2020 and after what we've been through in the last 4.5 years, can India and China ever fully trust each other?
Yeah, it's a very major issue, because once we have reached that kind of distrust and actual casualties on both sides, it's not very easy to come back to a relationship of trust. And an attempt has been made. Of course, it has taken 4.5 years. So that we have to give credit to the leaders on the two sides, that despite the feelings which had been aroused very much on the Indian side, and also, perhaps we do not know what was on the Chinese side, but we felt that Chinese had not been able to keep up to their commitments and had really extended their reach to those areas which they had never done earlier. So I can only think that they were under the impression that India had become part of either some kind of Asian NATO or extended NATO, or this Quad will turn into something. But I think there are a few other things which took place. AUKUS came into being. The Indians came into some kind of a negative focus in the Western media, and that showed that the Indians have a different viewpoint from the West and will not be able to become completely a part of any alliance, military alliance on the Western side.
But wasn't
So
that
I
always
think-
known? I mean, India has always said that we don't want to be part of any kind of military alliance, West-led or anyone else-led. I'm still curious to find out, yes, I get the rationale that, from Beijing's point of view, all the Quad and, the coming together of the democracies around the Indo-Pacific, it seemed, at least from their point of view, sort of targeted at China. But the point is that the Quad's been around for a while. What fundamentally changed in the summer of 2020 is that the existing arrangements that you had, which served both countries well from 1993, 1996, and a shot not being fired since 1986, that got appended by a unilateral Chinese action. And frankly, I don't think any of us, even today, know 4 years on, why China did what it did.
Only the Chinese experts can tell us what was going on in their mind. Were there problems domestically, or they had been put under pressure from the Americans that they will be the next adversary for the Americans? So what they had done to the Soviet Union might happen to China also. So that could have been in their mind. As far as India is concerned, we were very clear that we wanted to promote peaceful relations, and our Prime Minister has been talking to various adversaries, whether in Europe or in Middle East, telling them that we have to bring about peace and use the dialogue process in order to reach that level. So there was no question that we do something for Europe and Middle East, but do something completely different for Asia. So therefore, Chinese perhaps were convinced ultimately that what India was saying was really very, very much committed to their own principles. And I think the Russians may have also been, because at one time I remember the Russians also started talking about Asian NATO. So they changed that, and they had started moving closer to Pakistan and tried to give them some weaponry, etc. But I think the whole thing has changed, because we find that while the Pakistanis had gone much closer to the Americans, the Indians have come into an adversarial kind of position with regard to the Khalistani terrorists who have found shelter in the West. And also there are these issues which are like our neighborhood has been destabilized, not simply because the Chinese have been there, but because of the Chinese, the Americans have taken a big role there.
So
Earlier, they
let
were
me
quite
ask,
willing to allow India.
let me ask Mr. Tangent from Beijing what the Chinese view is, because one thing we have seen, Mr. Tangent, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, is that the countries, and China has disputes with many countries, with the Philippines, with Japan, South Korea, other countries in Southeast Asia, India of course being one of them, and of course the big one, which is China v. United States. The countries that have put their foot down and refused to relent to this Chinese bullying. I mean, look at what's been happening with the Philippines, for example. Every week there is some story about a Coast Guard vessel or a Chinese naval vessel ramming into a Philippines fishing boat. And you are seeing a sort of determination from the Philippines not to give in to this kind of bullying. And that's what we've seen with India as well. That at the end of the day, for 4.5 years, it's been long, it's been painful, but India staked out and managed to convince China or bring China on board for whatever this patrolling arrangement is that's been agreed upon by both sides. And that is frankly the only lesson to draw from here, that you cannot have any unilateral change of the status quo. And if China tries to do that, the only choice that countries have is to dig in and put their foot down.
Is that a statement or a question?
That is
quite frankly,
question to understanding how this breakthrough was brought about.
Okay, the breakthrough came about because I think Modi was very upset with the U.S. actions in terms of his election. The fact that he went to Moscow, as was previously pointed out, was not well accepted in Washington. And at the same time, just after the election, he said to Jay Shankar that settling this border dispute was a priority. When you get the politicians involved and push the generals to the side, you can get things done, because this is about diplomacy, not about tactics. So, then you have Bangladesh, then you have basically the Five Eyes, all English speaking, lining up against India on issues involving Canada and things like this. I think India's made it very clear that it is a sovereign nation. It is not the Philippines, and Modi is not Bongbong Marcos. Now you have to keep in mind, you mentioned these ships colliding, but that the first ship collided a day after it was announced that the Pentagon had mounted a disinformation campaign against Chinese vaccines, which killed a number of Filipinos because they thought that they would turn into crocodiles. And it's just curious how just one day after the Pentagon admitted, after a story by Reuters that uncovered it, yeah, we did it and we do it again because anything to get at China. So one day later, all of a sudden, that story disappears and it's replaced by a young man losing his thumb because the boat rammed into a Chinese Coast Guard cutter. So you have these things. It's quite clear the U.S. wants to contain China. They were counting on using the old colonial strategy of divide and conquer, try to use India as a doorstop. And but at the same time, they were making it very clear that India had to go along with whatever it is that Washington wanted. India is not in that position anymore. It is not a colonial vassal to anybody, and it's going to decide its own fate. And remember, between China and India, it is two neighbors. And, it takes two to tango, and they have done it successfully. And now they're at the Brics summit, basically speaking from the same hymn book about trying to make sure that there's peace on there and that there's economic development going forward.
No, but Mr. Tangent, you're simply discounting the question as to who disturbed the peace. Who changed the status quo?
Well, from the Chinese perspective...
It's not India that went and sent its troops to those areas that are claimed by China. It is China that sent its soldiers and led to the clash. I mean, even before Galwan happened in June, from April of 2020, they were trying to needle India. I mean, you're completely overlooking that or simply not even mentioning that.
Okay, you weren't there. I'm not there. I can't testify as to what happened. I can tell you that from both sides, there was irritation growing. Frictions were growing because both sides were increasing the roads and encampments along that border. And there were frictions going on. At some point, it spilled over into bloody violence. How that happened is not clear. From the Chinese side, they believe that it was India. From the Indian side, they believe it was the Chinese. There was, a colonel who took two of his guys and kicked over a Chinese tent, and that seemed to start off the melee that then resulted in all these casualties. But, when you put soldiers eyeball to eyeball on a line and you start hyping them up about, defending your country, accidents are going to happen. That's why you need to pull them apart to get people away from a situation where accidents
Mr. Tangent,
can
I think you're mixing up the timelines entirely. It was China that first sent tens of thousands of troops to try and change the status quo. The incident happened when there was a pushback, when there was a pushback from the Indian side. And then, of course, the Indian side had to match the build-up man for man. But let me, I want to put that in the past. I want to ask Zorawar, what is the trajectory forward? Now, you heard from both the principals, Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi Jinping, saying that they've authorized their special representatives, the NSA from the Indian side and the state councillor from the Chinese side, to take the conversation forward. Now, we've had, I don't know how many rounds of special representative talks. We've been having SR level talks from the time Brajesh Mishra was NSA. The point is, even if you were to resolve the current impasse, which is disengagement, de-escalation and de-induction, the moot dispute of the border still remains. And the only mechanism that India and China have to resolve that moot dispute is the special representatives mechanism, which has been running for the last 20 years. And frankly, it's not really resolved anything.
Zaka, you're absolutely right. So I think let's step back. The overall dispute over the common frontiers obviously goes back to the 1950s. It's a very old dispute. They've had occasions in the past where they came close to settling the dispute once and for all. For various geopolitical reasons, domestic reasons, they couldn't get their consensus to come into place. So what they decided after the Cold War ended in the 1990s is that this larger dispute is not going to be solved in a generation or two, but we still need to find some form of stability to allow the relationship to emerge and evolve in its own terms. So that's when these confidence building agreements came in the 1990s. And what we saw was they lasted for a period of time. But as the balance of power began to change, as India and China became more prosperous, they invested in their military power, they began to project power on all their frontiers, and particularly in the Himalayan frontiers. So as that jostling for advantage grew in the 2000s to 2010s, you saw a series of mini crises playing out 2013, 2017. And finally, I think 2020 was this tipping point where the old arrangements just became unsustainable. Chinese, of course, have always had an advantage over India because of geography, because of infrastructure, just because of the asymmetry of the terrain, where they could move and mobilize forces much faster than India. So it's true that there have been occasions when they have used that advantage for themselves. They have tried to coerce India. But that period has always eventually returned to some kind of normalcy after negotiations. They have not been able to extract any permanent advantages. So this particular crisis over 4.5 years, I think it seems that there may have been an aspect in the Chinese military establishment that let's now freeze these frontiers permanently to our advantage, forget about what the Indians want. But then I think there was another picture in the Chinese political thinking which seems to suggest that if that were to occur, you would see a complete breakdown of the Sino-Indian relationship and any kind of return and the repercussions geopolitically, right, with the US-India relationship, possibility of a Cold War coming in. So I think what the Chinese have done quite sensibly is, which they've had this strategy in the past, that focus on your core threats, which are in the Western Pacific, neutralize other fronts, calm down those fronts. The India front is a peripheral front for it. As long as India is not party to a military alliance system, which it is not, India does not pose that kind of a clear and present danger.
Okay.
Once that decision was taken in Beijing, I think it became easy for them to instruct the PLA to make show flexibility and allow the LAC to return to normalcy. Now we'll see what the ingredients will be.
Let me ask Nitin. You know, one of the points that Rao made is, look, we've come to a patrolling arrangement, but that is the top of the pie. What was underpinning the patrolling arrangement as it existed till 2020 was, despite the skirmishes every now and then, which you referenced to, what was underpinning was the agreements of 93 and 1996. That is what China tore apart in 2020 with its actions in Galwan. Now, they've agreed to a patrolling arrangement back on Monday, but what about those underlying agreements? Are we going back to 93 and 96? Do we have to find fresh agreements? Do we know what the contours of those fresh agreements will be? Because, frankly, I mean, 93 and 96 has been unilaterally changed and torn apart by China and Chinese action in 2020.
True. So, any case, nobody is expecting those agreements to be adhered to now because they've been torn apart, as you said. So, I'm expecting going forward as things move forward gradually, and it's going to be a long road ahead. Let me say this. This is just a first step. So, there's no point in getting euphoric or getting elated about what's happened. It's just the beginning of a restart, I would say. So what could happen is that there would be new SOPs, standard operating procedures, new arrangements for patrolling. So one of the things one is hearing is that there could be coordinated patrols, especially in the high tension areas like Depsang and Demchok and some areas in Arunachal Pradesh or opposite Arunachal Pradesh in the eastern sector, where pre-information would be given to each other. When the patrols go, the number of soldiers in the patrol would be limited. All the transparency will be maintained so that you make your claim, you go to the claim lines, but you don't come across each other. Some kind of an arrangement will happen there. But the larger picture is that India has now demonstrated both its resolve and its ability to withstand Chinese military coercion, which they tried since 2020. They have perfected the art of mobilizing forces in large numbers in the last 4.5 years. So it's a net gain for Indian military in that sense.
I do want to get
those arrangements go.
two details from you, Nitin, before I go to Mr. Shashank for the bigger picture. One, what about all of these permanent structures that both sides are alleging the other side has built in these disputed areas over the last 4.5 years? And two, more importantly, I think there's a political opposition argument that's been made by Congress Party and other parties here in India that these buffer zones are largely on Indian land.
Well, I don't think that is true about the buffer zones. And you must look at the Chinese literature, Chinese language blogs and chat rooms where people are questioning the Chinese leadership. Why have you given up the flame lines or the places where you went in?
Okay.
So there is a questioning there in a muted form. But to talk about the arrangements that you spoke about, that the buffer zones are not on the Indian side. The other is that the first point, structures that you made, that the structures will be there, but if you can inform each other, you're not coming and occupying those structures. You just keep them and maintain them now that you build them. Some of them can still be dismantled. And I think that will be a matter of detail between military commanders as they go along. And I think the key is to go right down to the commanding officers at various friction points where they will talk to each other and then come up with a solution which will be then endorsed by the political leadership or the diplomats. Will also come in there.
So, Mr. Shashank, the bigger picture being that for particularly the last 6 months to a year or so, China's position was, look, this border issue is vexed. Let's put that aside. Let's put that in a box and then deal with the other parts of the relationship, trade, investment, other concerns and so on. India's position was, and I think the External Affairs Minister has said this on a number of occasions, that the relationship is not normal. And it will not become normal until the border is settled, until we go back to pre-2020 status quo as it existed. And now the feeling is that, yes, we have gone to pre-2020 status quo. So the question then becomes, are we going to see some degree of normalization in the trade relationship when it comes to investments, particularly in critical areas and so on and so forth? If you look at, for example, what the Chief Economic Advisor put out in his report a day before the budget was presented, he was very clear about welcoming in Chinese investment. So do you reckon that was the motivation for finally finding a resolution to this situation on the border for the last 4 years?
Well, it could happen from the Chinese side.
Yes, from the
but
Chinese
side.
I
feel that the Chinese really made a wrong study of the Indian development pattern, that India would be also building roads and infrastructure along the border, which it had not done for a long time in the past. So therefore, Chinese perhaps wanted to coerce the Indians, which apparently is likely to change now. And we'll have to just see how much does it change. Till that time, we have to keep our position very, very secure, make sure that we do not seem to be giving in to the Chinese coercion. That is number one. Secondly, yes, we are developing these strategic tie-ups with the Asian supply chains, and Prime Minister has gone to some of the Southeast Asian countries. Foreign Minister has also spoken to these people that we are now trying to build up once again the relationships on the economic and trade front with the other Asian countries. So I think if that takes place, the Chinese are already well integrated with them. So there is a possibility that there will be some movement forward in that direction. Now, whether we go back to RCEP, the Regional Cooperation and Economic Program, which we had withdrawn because we did not want to commit ourselves totally to Chinese taking over the preponderant position and taking advantage of the Indian markets. So we'll just have to be quite clear and see that how does it move. But we have to become part of the Asian supply chains in a much more active manner.
So Mr. Tangent and then Zorawar for the final word. Mr. Tangent, I come back to that point. I'm not sure. Yeah, there are minor irritants in the relationship between India and the West, particularly India and Canada, for sure. There's definitely some irritants in the India-US relationship. But if you were to take a longer-term view, I don't think India ever wants to or has the luxury of being part of any kind of military alliance. Number two, I think that's very clear. That was as clear in 2020 as it is in 2024. So that point of yours, I'm not sure how valid that is. But more importantly, to think that India would be a doorstop, the phrase that you used, I mean, it completely beggars understanding. of Indian foreign policy or what this country's outreach has been to imagine that, India is suddenly going to be part of the Washington camp. It's just, a naive understanding. So the point is, again, I keep going back to this. This was as true in 2020 as it was in 2024. The reason why China unilaterally tried to change the status quo, and I think Zorav is right, I think they sensed an opportunity. They wanted to press the case to try and see if they can make permanent in some form or fashion these claims along the disputed LAC. And the result is it led to a clash that we haven't seen in 40 years and this impasse over the last four and a half years. And finally, here we are. That is what has happened.
All right. Well, if you're saying that Washington is naive in believing that India is somehow going to enter a military alliance, I would agree with you. In terms of your understanding of China, I would say that this is a weakness in a relationship between these two neighbors. They really know very little about each other. And as you've demonstrated, you really do not have a very good finger on the pulse of exactly what's happening in China. But that's true in China in terms of understanding India. I think long term, if there's going to be trust, there has to be a greater understanding on both sides. And that means that there has to be track to diplomacy that brings these sides together so they understand the differences and respect them. Both are very old civilizations. They're not going to change because somebody does something different, whether it's the United States or China or Russia. They will adhere to their core values, and that is their right, and it's part of your culture. So I don't think that this is insurmountable. I think that China and India have a lot more in common than they have apart, but they're always going to be different, and there's no way that I believe that India will turn its back on the West unless the West does something very extreme. I think India is best served by not choosing, by saying that they will choose India, not choose China or the United States or any other country.
Okay. Zorav, I'll give you the final word. This is a difficult one. I mean, I had a guest on the show last night saying that, look, whether we like it or not, we are increasingly moving in the direction of a two-camp world. You have the US-led world order with its European partners, NATO allies, etc., and then you have a Russia-China-led world order. Clearly, Russia and China have an interest in changing the current US-led world order. The problem is that India, for now, is trying to sort of manage both sides. It's largely with the Western sort of led world order because it is in our interest that this continues. Yet at the same time, we can't afford to ignore Russia. We can't afford to, have an inimical or hostile relationship with China. But how long do you continue putting two legs in two boats?
No, Zaka, so I'm going to actually offer a little more of a sophisticated response. I think the idea that India has accepted a bipolar fragmentation of the world, I don't think that's true at all. I think the Indian side, along with many large members and states of the global south, are seeking a multipolar world, a multi-civilizational world, a world that has enough space for other major powers, not just the traditional powers in the West. And it seems that in Delhi, there is an understanding that even Moscow seeks this kind of a plural, multilateral, multi-civilizational world order. Beijing's position originally may have been different. It remains to be seen, are they adapting to this? But certainly there is absolutely no doubt that a part of the Beijing's international policies are invested in promoting this multipolar world. So even at a narrow level, if there is a common interest in, let's say, Brics and other measures to create these non-Western alternatives, I think that's in the national interest of India and the national interest of China. And I think that is the biggest motivator to the Modi government and Xi Jinping to bury the hatchet on their frontiers and seek these kinds of collaborative opportunities. That doesn't mean competition will end. Geopolitical differences have lasted 100 years, even during British India. They will continue. But how you manage them and how you play them out, I think there's a recognition in Delhi that if you do not stabilize and manage your China ties, your prospects to be a major power get diminished in the coming decades.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I go back to what the late Pranab Mukherjee said. I mean, you don't get to choose your neighbors, you get to choose your friends, but you have to have a working relationship with your neighbors, and particularly in the case of two big countries like India and China, with such complicated histories and such a disputed line of actual control that runs up to 3,500 kilometers, you have to find some kind of a normalcy where you're not having 50,000 troops on either side of the LAC, sort of guns cocked at each other. But we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for this fascinating conversation. I also want to go across and try and get a perspective from Washington, because that is really the elephant in the room. You heard the view from Beijing. They are convinced that India was moving towards the American camp, and therefore China did what it did to try and warn India or deter India. The Indian view, of course, is that India can never be part of any one country-led alliance, certainly not a military alliance. So what's the view from Washington? Lisa Curtis, Indo-Pacific expert from the Center for New American Security, is now joining us. We've had the conclusion of the 16th Brics summit in Kazan in Russia. Brics, I was just going through some data, in a few years will be bigger by GDP than the G7. And a lot of these countries, Russia, China, India, some of them want to create a new world order. They are not finding the existing world order led by the United States beneficial to them. And countries like India are asking for a more expanded world order, a more multipolar world order, if you will. Do you think that such a thing is possible? Because the feeling is that the United States will never let such a thing to come to pass, that a multipolar world will be allowed, because the US is, the superpower of the world, as it were.
Well, I don't think that the international community will look at Prime Minister Modi's participation in the BRICS summit as either suspicious. They won't welcome it either. So I think, it won't be either. I think that the BRICS has been around for 15 years now. India's, been a founding member. And I think the real issue is the BRICS really accomplishing anything? Because even though it's been around for 15 years, you can't really point to anything tangible that the BRICS has been able to do. And, they're trying to expand the membership. But I think if you look closely at the members and some of the own problems that these members have with each other, then I think you can see that it's unlikely the BRICS is going to be able to come to any kind of coherent unity and be able to accomplish any real objectives. You've got India-China tensions. You have tensions between Iran and the UAE, the new members who are joining. So I really don't think that the international community thinks much of BRICS. I don't think they see it as a threat. And certainly they don't welcome it either.
But tell me this, the current BRICS summit comes at an interesting time, a very crucial time. There are two wars going on. There is the Russia-Ukraine war, there is the Israel-Hamas war. And I guess part of why Mr. Putin wants to project all these world leaders coming on one stage is to try and send out a signal to the West that, look, you thought my country is done, you thought I'm done for when the Ukraine war started, but I'm not. I've got the leaders of not just the 5 big countries, but also now with the newer members, it's almost a 10-member grouping, all sort of converging on the Russian mainland. The question is that, all of this coming just a few weeks before the United States goes to polls, and how may this emerging group of BRICS and SCO and others in which the US is not a part, this is primarily driven by countries like Russia, China, India. How do you see that changing the geopolitical landscape? Because both these wars, it will take significant American leverage and will to end both of these wars, whether it is in Ukraine or whether it is in the Middle East.
Well, I'm not sure about that because, Prime Minister Modi met with Putin this past summer. And I think that visit did cause a great deal of consternation in the United States. But that was because of the timing of that visit, which came the same day that the NATO summit was being opened in Washington, D.C. And of course, also problematic was that the Russians had bombed a school the day before Modi's visit. So that definitely raised some eyebrows back in D.C. But then, of course, Prime Minister Modi has visited Zelensky. He recently visited President Zelensky. That was welcome. So I don't think that Washington finds it surprising to see Prime Minister Modi meeting with the Russian president or even the Iranian president at this point. I think you look at how far the U.S.-India relationship has come, and despite some of the irritants, whether that's Russia or the attempted assassination plot, there certainly have been some irritants in the relationship. But if you look at how deep and strong the U.S.-India bilateral relationship is, I think you can see that there's a very strong foundation there that can weather some of these irritants. And we've had visits by senior Indian leaders. We had a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden just a couple of weeks ago in Wilmington, Delaware. We had a major Quad summit. So India is a global player. It has many relationships across the world, as it should. It's an emerging global power. So I don't see that this Brics summit is really going to cause much stir.
But tell me this, Lisa, the sidelines of the BRICS summit, you also had the meetings of the leaders of India and China. They've signed a key border agreement. It sort of ends what has been a pretty tumultuous phase for the last 4 years or so. This is the first time in 5 years that Prime Minister Modi has held bilateral talks with Xi Jinping of China. How is this, again, going to be seen in Washington? Will this be viewed with suspicion that India and China are sort of burying the hatchet for now? Will that be viewed as a challenge, or would the United States welcome greater engagement between India and China?
I think Washington would welcome the fact that India and China have been able to move forward on their border dispute. Look, it was a very unjustified aggression that China took against India in 2020. And I think the U.S. showed itself to be a very reliable partner for India during that crisis between India and China. And, unfortunately, the Chinese had sort of dug in their heels, whereas India stood strong and said that it wasn't going to reestablish normal diplomatic relations with China until they returned to the status quo ante, that is April 2020, force positions in the Ladakh region. So finally, after 4.5 years, it looks like China has finally agreed to do this, to go back to the status quo, allow Indian soldiers to be able to patrol in areas that China, had not allowed this to happen. This is in Demchok and Depsang Plains area. So,
final word as we are coming to the concluding part. Final question. All of this happening just a few days before the U.S. elections. It is a neck-and-neck fight between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. The toughest election in a generation, many are saying. Who do you think has the edge? And more importantly, if it's a Harris victory or a Trump victory, how may that change the United States' relationship with India, or will it not change? Does it not matter who is the next occupant of the White House?
I really don't think it will make much of a difference. We don't know who's going to be elected. This is a nail biter of an election. It's really too close to call. It's really going to depend on a handful of battleground states, maybe even come down to just one or two states. And we actually may not have a clear result for a few weeks. More and more people are talking about, how we might see a similar situation that we saw in 2000 when you had a disputed election and it took actually months to resolve it. Mm-hmm. So, we're going to have some uncertainty perhaps. But okay. I can say this, no matter if it's a Harris administration or a second Trump administration, I believe that the U.S.-India relationship will remain strong. It will remain stable. The initiatives that have been started under the Biden administration will certainly be continued. We're even looking at potential new initiatives. Kurt Campbell has announced that there will be an Indian Ocean dialogue between the U.S. and India this fall. And things like that are supported by both sides of the aisle. I think
All right.
Democrats and Republicans alike see the logic, they see the importance of a strong U.S.-India relationship, and that simply won't change no matter who is elected in November.
All right, Lisa Curtis, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining us from the Center for New American Security, Indo-Pacific expert, giving us her thoughts on the Brics summit and, of course, the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping of China. Quick break here in the program. When we come back on the other side, two leaked documents from U.S. intelligence showing Israel's war plans in how it intends to attack Iran. Two big questions. Is America spying on its closest ally in the Middle East, which is Israel? How do these documents leak? And more importantly, what do they reveal? What is Israel's strategy against Iran? Is it going to attack nuclear facilities and energy facilities? We'll try and dig deeper on the other side.
A firm handshake there right before the bilateral meeting began. We see the two leaders sit down with their teams on both sides. Several issues were...
to meet you in Kazan. It's the first time for us to have a formal meeting in 5 years' time. Both the people in our two countries and the international community are paying great attention to our meeting. China and India are both ancient civilizations, major developing countries, and important members of the global South. We are both at a crucial phase in our respective modernization endeavors. It best serves the fundamental interests of our two countries and two peoples, for both sides to keep to the trend of history and the right direction of our bilateral relations. It's important for both sides to have more communication and cooperation, properly handle our differences and disagreements, and to facilitate each other's pursuit of development aspirations. It's also important for both sides to shoulder our international responsibility, set an example for boosting the strength and unity of the developing countries, and to contribute to promoting multipolarization and democracy in international relations.
我愿同总理先生就两国关系和共同关心的问题交换意见。
Mr. Prime Minister, I'm prepared to exchange views with Your Excellency on our bilateral relationship and issues of mutual interest.
Excellency, आपसे मिलकर खुशी है और जैसा आपने कहा 5 साल के बाद हमारी फॉर्मल मीटिंग हो रही है। हमारा मानना है कि भारत और चीन के संबंधों का महत्व केवल हमारे लोगों के लिए ही नहीं, लेकिन वैश्विक शांति, स्थिरता और प्रगति के लिए भी हमारे संबंध बहुत अहम है। एक्सेलेंसी, सीमा पार पिछले 4 वर्षों में उत्पन्न हुए मुद्दों पर बनी सहमति का हम स्वागत करते हैं। सीमा पर शांति और स्थिरता बनाए रखना हमारी प्राथमिकता रहनी चाहिए। म्यूचुअल ट्रस्ट, म्यूचुअल रिस्पेक्ट और म्यूचुअल सेंसिटिविटी हमारे संबंधों का आधार बने रहना चाहिए। आज इन सभी विषयों पर बात करने का अवसर मिला है। मुझे विश्वास है कि हम खुले मन से बातचीत करेंगे और हमारी चर्चा कंस्ट्रक्टिव होगी। धन्यवाद।
तो दोनों नेताओं के बीच ये मुलाकात हुई है रूस के
remarks of both those leaders there before the bilateral. The Prime Minister making it very clear that what's transpired at the line of actual control in the last 4 years needs to be amended. We welcome the step that has been taken as far as disengagement at the line of actual control is concerned. Mutual trust and respect is required. Mutual sensitivity is also key to ensure that there is stability at the line of actual control, was a clear message that the Prime Minister sent out during that bilateral meeting. Several other issues, of course, did come up, but the situation at the line of actual control is one that focus is going to be on, because that is going to decide the course of what else is discussed and the outcome of everything else, because this, of course, is going to be of topmost priority. Relations between India and China needs to be stable, not just for the two countries, but also for global peace, is what the Prime Minister said. Let's listen into that comment once again.
एक्सेलेंसी, आपसे मिलकर खुशी है, और जैसा आपने कहा 5 साल के बाद हमारी ये फॉर्मल मीटिंग हो रही है। हमारा मानना है कि भारत और चीन के संबंधों का महत्व केवल हमारे लोगों के लिए ही नहीं, लेकिन वैश्विक शांति, स्थिरता और प्रगति के लिए भी हमारे संबंध बहुत अहम है। एक्सेलेंसी, सीमा पार पिछले 4 वर्षों में उत्पन्न हुए मुद्दों पर बनी सहमति का हम स्वागत करते हैं। सीमा पर शांति और स्थिरता बनाए रखना हमारी प्राथमिकता रहनी चाहिए। म्यूचुअल ट्रस्ट, म्यूचुअल रिस्पेक्ट और म्यूचुअल सेंसिटिविटी हमारे संबंधों का आधार बने रहना चाहिए। आज इन सभी विषयों पर बात करने का अवसर मिला है। मुझे विश्वास है कि हम खुले मन से बातचीत करेंगे और हमारी चर्चा कंस्ट्रक्टिव होगी। धन्यवाद।
That was the Prime Minister there, unequivocally mentioning the line of actual control and the ties between the two countries, hinging on the fact that the situation at the line of actual control must be stable, and for that, mutual trust, mutual respect and mutual sensitivity is of utmost importance. Manju Seth and Colonel...
The leak of a pair of highly classified US intelligence documents which describe satellite images of Israeli military preparation for a potential strike on Iran has raised a lot of eyebrows. The 2 documents were prepared in recent days by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is responsible for analyzing images collected by American spy satellites. They began circulating last week on the Telegram app. They were being discussed largely by pro-Iran accounts on Telegram. The documents, which offer interpretations of the satellite imagery, provide insight into a potential strike by Israel on Iran within the next few days. Such a strike has been anticipated in retaliation for the Iranian assault earlier this month, in which Iran attacked mainstream Israeli cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem with close to 200 ballistic missiles. On Crux Decode, what do the documents reveal about the nature of Israel's planned response? How did these documents leak in the first place? Is America spying on its closest ally in the Middle East? And what may be the possible response by Iran if parts of this plan were to come to fruition? One of the documents is titled Israel, Air Force Continues Preparations for a Strike on Iran. It describes recent exercises which appear to rehearse certain elements of such a strike. The second document details how Israel is shifting the placement of its missiles and its other weapon systems in case Iran responded with its own set of strikes. Officials were divided about the seriousness of the leak, which did not appear to reveal any new American capabilities, but the documents describe not the satellite images per se, but what it does reveal, once again, is the degree to which the United States is potentially spying on one of its closest allies. Other US intel officials say that any exposure of one of America's closest allies and its war plans is a serious breach indeed. Officials did privately acknowledge that the documents were authentic, although the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence both declined to comment. US officials say that they did not know where the documents had been taken from and that they were still hunting for the original source of the leak. President Joe Biden was asked about this in Germany last Friday, whether he knew A, when Israel planned to strike and what kind of targets it had chosen to strike in Iran. And he responded yes and yes to both questions. He declined to speak any further on this topic. But his statement, that is President Biden's statement, seemed to hint that both him and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who have not often seen eye to eye on many issues regarding the war, they seem to have arrived at some kind of understanding about what targets Israel is going to hit inside Iran. Now, this is significant because earlier Biden had called on Israel to avoid hitting any of Iran's nuclear sites or its energy facilities. The US president has repeatedly raised concerns if these targets, particularly the nuclear targets, which are Iran's crown jewels, were destroyed, then Tehran would quickly escalate. The documents that have been leaked describe satellite photographs of an Israeli military exercise on the 15th of October in preparation for a potential retaliatory strike on Iran. Part of the purpose of this exercise was to practice air-to-air refueling and search and rescue operations as per these leaked documents. The exercise involved a force which is of a similar size to what Israel had used in a strike on Yemen back in late September. The documents also discuss Israeli preparations of long-range, air-launched ballistic missiles, air-to-air surface missiles, and air refueling planes, as well as other support aircraft. The documents also say that Israel was conducting covert surveillance on Iran along with drones. But the officials also say that the documents were not a comprehensive assessment of what the United States knows about Israel's intentions. The documents, which are dated October 15th, represent only what analysts are looking at satellite imagery could determine at that time. But this is not the first time that US intel has been leaked on such a big scale. A year ago, a large trove of classified material, which first appeared on a Discord server a couple of years ago, were made public in April of 2023. An Air National Guardsman, Jack Teixeira, had pleaded guilty to 6 counts of violating the Espionage Act. In exchange, he got a prison sentence of about 16 years. A US official said that the investigation is examining who had access to this alleged Pentagon document. Any such leak would automatically trigger an investigation by the FBI alongside the Pentagon and the US intelligence agencies. Both the FBI and the Pentagon have declined to comment. It's not clear how these documents became public or whether they were hacked or deliberately leaked by an individual concerned in the defense establishment. The US is already on high alert about possible Iranian hacking campaigns. In fact, US intelligence agencies had said back in August that Iran had hacked documents belonging to Donald Trump's campaign. Again, there were concerns in the defense and intelligence establishments, but nothing more came of it. The leak comes at an extremely sensitive moment in US-Israeli ties and is bound to anger the Israelis who've been preparing to strike Iran in response to the missile barrage on the 1st of October. One of the documents also suggests that something that Israel has always declined to confirm publicly, that the country has nuclear weapons. The document says that the United States has not seen any indications of Israel planning to use a nuclear weapon against Iran, but it's also unlikely to deploy these nukes, even if they were tactical ones, against Iran, given the scope of a rapid escalation by Tehran. Meanwhile, an already volatile region teeters on the edge in anticipation of Israel's strike.
Viewers, after a 5-year-long virtual diplomatic freeze, Prime Minister Modi and President Jinping held talks on Russian soil. Whether President Putin has played a role in facilitating the talks is not known, but the unexpectedness of the meeting has attracted a lot of global attention, particularly in the United States, United Kingdom and Europe. Not in the least because a lack of cohesion in the East advantages the West, particularly at a time when the two spheres are at loggerheads over Ukraine, the conflict in the heart of Europe. The Modi-Xi Jinping summit meeting